Donc ça, c'est l'Ermitage Blanc 21. But this wine is, in some ways, a bit more trendy, as I said before, because it's more tight. You know, it's more based on the Maison Blanc, the style.
That's why.
By nature, it's a bit more what it is.
쉽지 않은 빈티라고 접근성은 확실히 좋아.
See, the next problem in wine, I think, at the big scale, will be the rosé.
Of course, yes.
Because it was very trendy, and they couldn't keep up. But now, all the wine industry made rosé, and there's so much rosé, and there will be too much.
Yeah.
And it's what happened in Beaujolais back in the days. You know,
Oh, yeah.
Beaujolais Nouveau. It used to be like in Japan. It used to be massive in Japan, massive, and it was very hard for Beaujolais to recover because it's a beautiful wine region. Beaujolais, they make beautiful, simple wines, but to take so much time to recover.
And Jean-Louis, could you explain about the 2022 vintage?
22 vintage is like, I mean, now again, it's all this idea of global warming because our history is so long. So I will say in our gene, we've seen everything already. We've seen like some heat, some rain, some floods, we've seen so many things. So there is nothing that happens now that we haven't seen in the past, for sure. Now maybe what's different is like things happen maybe in a shorter time. And that's the thing with heat. And 22 for sure is pretty hot vintage. It's pretty hot and dry. Being hot is something, being dry is something else. And 22 is hot and dry. So actually what happened, as I said for the whites, we started to harvest early in August. That's an example I like to say. It's my father is the only one in our story that is not a Louis or a Jean, is Gérard. And the Saint Gérard is in October. So back in the days, the harvest was in October and all the ladies and we're making flowers, giving flowers to my dad. You know, Saint Gérard was a big thing for the harvest. And then from his Saint Gérard, we moved to September 9, which is my dad's birth year. But now, for me, I'm August 22. And we're moving to my birth year. It's crazy. So actually, I told you the white, we picked the white on the 23rd, because I said I won't harvest the day of my birth year yet. Maybe one day, but not this year. Okay. Because I don't want 22 to be the year I pick grapes on my birth year. So maybe in the future, but I'm not ready yet. So I waited on the 23rd to start the harvest. So because we could have picked on the 22nd, and I said no,
Not
okay,
today.
let's wait, we'll see. So I said, let's wait tomorrow. So that's the thing with 22. And actually we picked the white, the red, still in September, but on 1st. But what is interesting though in 22, it's early and ripe, but it doesn't taste too ripe. It doesn't taste cooked, jammy, it's fresh. 2003, we had this very heat wave, very warm, and then the vine, just like us, went crazy. The big difference between 23 and 22 is, I think, the vines and adapt in a certain way. And the way they adapt is like, even when it's very warm, and that's something we've seen in 22 and a bit in 23, is the vine said, stop, no more, and they shut down. So actually, the leaves don't dry and fail, the grapes don't shrivel and concentrate, and the vines like, and they wait. And this is, in a way, is what happened in 2022, is why the wines are very fruity, fresh, and they don't taste like early picked harvest. And I think that's what happened. And difficult for us to explain what happened, but that's the way they taste. You will see all the wines will taste. I think still one of the problems we're facing here in Northern Rhone is people talk or taste Syrah. Like in Burgundy, they don't taste Pinot Noir. They taste Clos Vougeot. They taste more the place than the grape. But and I think like when we are very good here with Syrah, it's about the same thing. It's not about it's not about the grape. It's really about the place.
여기가 뉴셀러인데 지은 지가 한 7년 정도 됐어요. 여기서 이제 지금 이제 에르미타주 블렌딩 하기 전에 아까 화이트 테스팅한 것처럼 이제 끌리는 걸로 테스팅을 하실 거예요.
From another specific place called Bachasson. So that's a hill, pretty steep hill, pure granite, very decomposed granite. Okay, a bit more rustic, tight, lean, cloudy, salty, iodine wine. So that's a terroir is next to Péliard, that is called Les Baumes. And Les Baumes is very different. It's more profound, more tight, a bit more spicy, has more power. The soil is what we call pudding stone. It's the little pebbles that are pushed by the glaciers, and because of the limestone, they got cemented actually one to the other, and it looks like concrete, like a raw concrete. You see, with 22, in the wines you don't have this idea of overripe.
Yeah, not overripe. Yeah.
The wines are fresh.
Yeah.
And how come? Because the vintage is not about being fresh, it's about being very hot and dry. But the wine stays fresh. And why? I don't know. We need more time to understand this. But the problem in wine, we only make wine once a year. So as opposed to a chef or cooks like, he can change his recipe and experiment. So for us to understand what's happening with nature, we need maybe another generation. So the big question that we have in Hermitage that they don't have in Burgundy, because in Burgundy their story is to say we bottle everything separate, and because everything is so different. Our story in Hermitage is because it's so different that we have to blend to make the best Hermitage as possible.
Right.
The philosophy of Hermitage is to say, okay, maybe we need 15% of these, 10%, because we don't know really what Hermitage is about. In Burgundy, I don't want to say it's easier for them, but for us, when you have all these wines, you don't know what is Hermitage, and everything is in your mind. For us, we need to make a decision.
Yeah, right.
2021 Hermitage. It's a vintage that is not easy to talk about it because it's kind of different because it's not about the heat. We had good grapes, but it's not about the heat. What is interesting in wine now, I think it's we don't know anymore what is a great vintage. Okay, back. I don't want to say that's a great vintage, but in the way to think, because in the 80s and 90s, the great vintage, which is still true, is like very warm, perfect grapes, big wines. Talking about the 80s, 82, Bordeaux, Pité 85,
Burgundy.
in Burgundy, 90,
Rhone.
all over.
Yeah.
Okay, that was a great vintage because we had very few vintage where the grapes were sounds, ripe, perfect. But now in the 2000 and whatever, 09, 10, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19,
20.
So, wow. So in theory, all these vintages are great vintage. But then at the end, what is a great vintage? And 21 is interesting because, I mean, clearly it's not a great vintage, it's a difficult vintage. But the wines is more about this being soft and nice than to be powerful and tannic.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
I started wine like at 24 years. It's like since 2000.
Okay.
When I was young, I follow on just the great vintage, like a Bordeaux 2000, 2003, 2005. But you know, over the 2 decades, I don't follow that great year. Like Rhone is very difficult year 2013, but I love it. It's very drinkable and
That's it.
very elegant.
That's it.
Yeah.
And, I mean, again, it's about food and people.
Yeah.
C'est
맛있게
mais vraiment
이렇게 수입을 하니까
profondément.
제일 어려운 사람인데
Et après, ah non, non,
아저씨랑 안샘 아저씨.
this is 92. And
Your
then-
first vintage, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. I don't want to compare 21 and 92 because I think 21 for some technical reason it's better than 92. But what they have in common is they're from the same place and they are not the perfect vintage.
Actually, people talk about the 92 vintage is not a great year.
I know, maybe like a
but
catastrophe.
I
but-
still, if
but-
you blind testing for this wine,
Oh, yeah.
that's fantastic.
No, no, no,
Yeah,
no,
yeah.
exactly.
I tested 78,
Yeah,
19,
yeah, yeah.
93. Oh, but I never tested 92, but this one is great. Yeah.
No, it's great. For sure, it's not. You know, it's not. But I think at the end, what is important is to be sincere to the place. You know, to be true to the place, and then is what it is.
빈티지는 빈티지 그 빈티지의 캐릭터를 좋아하지 와인에 대해서 평가를 안 했으면 좋겠어. 이게 진짜 좋다. 지금 이제 테스팅 끝나고 나오는 길인데 본인의 철학과 그다음에 본인의 때루와 이런 설명을 듣는 게 너무 행복해요. 여기 오늘 뭐 여러 와인 마셨지만은 사실 2022 빈티지가 굉장히 더운 빈티지였고 근데
맞아요.
그 더운 빈티지임에도 불구하고 굉장히 프레시하고 더운 빈티지인데 포도나무가 적응을 해가는 것 같아요. 그래서 2022 빈티지가 굉장히 임프레시브 했었고 2021 빈티지 이제 바틀링 된 거를 테스팅했는데 굉장히 우아하고 엘레강스한 샤브 특유의 스타일을 잘 표현했다. 그리고 사실은 뭐 꾸백했으면 다 필요 없고 오늘 92 빈티지 장루이가
샤브 형님이 첫 빈티지.
진짜 맛있었어요. 그러니까 너무 우아한 슈라의 끝을 보여줬다. 그래서 뭐 우리 장루이 형님 내년 3월이나 4월 초에 제가 장루이 한국으로 한번 재미난 이벤트를 기획을 또 하고 있어요. 샴페인 서울이 또 잘 돼서 이제는 이제 Meet the Legend라고 해서 레전드들을 한국으로 초대하는 자리를 또 가질까 해요. 그 중에 처음이 장루이샤브가 되지 않을까 싶습니다. 오늘 테스팅 즐거웠습니다. 감사합니다.